Next up, we have Ronald Pies, who's professor in the psychiatry departments of SUNY Upstate Medical University and Tufts University School of Medicine, correct? He's the author of Don't Worry, Nothing Will Turn Out All Right. And Everything Has Two Handles, The Stoic Guide to the Art of Living, which is one of the first books that I read on Stoicism, actually. And I often tell my little daughter, Poppy, she's 6 years old, that everything has two handles. She doesn't believe me. It doesn't, Daddy. Crazy. She looks at me like I'm crazy. But it does. Everything has two handles. And he's also the author of The Three-Petaled Rose, How the Synthesis of Judaism, Buddhism, and Stoicism Can Create a Healthy, Fulfilled, and Flourishing Life. And his talk is entitled Stoicism, Buddhism, and Judaism.
Well, thanks very much, Donald. Can folks hear me in back? Yeah, is it coming out okay? Well, I was going to say I'm extremely happy to be here, but in the present context, maybe I should say I am moderately happy. I'm extremely happy. See if we can get this up. I'm going to be trying to put Stoicism in the context of two really very broad and deep spiritual, philosophical, religious traditions, Buddhism and Judaism. I think it's important that when we talk about Stoicism, we also see it in the context of other traditions, philosophies, religions. And so this is really the map of what I'm going to do. Talk a bit about the timeline of the three traditions, historical links, possible historical links with heavy question marks there, the basic elements of the three traditions, some common features among Judaism, Buddhism, and Stoicism, what I sometimes facetiously call Jubusto. I will be talking about four key areas that I'll explain in a minute, and I'll do a little compare and contrast exercise to get a more in-depth look at these traditions. Just by way of personal disclosure, I was raised in a Jewish household, but I think it's fair to say I spent the first 18 years of my life tormenting my rabbi and probably disappointing my Orthodox grandfather. And it took many, many years for me to come around and start seeing anything of value in the Jewish tradition, which I'm happy to say I did. I am a psychiatrist, and so I have a natural affinity with REBT and CBT and some of the things that other folks have been talking about and will be talking about. There's a lot of material that I have to go over, and so how fast will we need to move through all this? As Larry David might say, pretty fast. But I understand that the slides will be available to folks afterwards, so don't worry about jotting things down. Well, the four areas that I want to look at as sort of windows into these traditions are listed in this slide: tact, empathy, compassion, anger, rage, revenge, worry, sorrow, depression, and joyfulness, gratitude, and pleasure. And I'll be digging into those in some detail. And the areas that I'm going to contrast are a little bit more metaphysical and maybe a little abstruse. And having heard Chuck's talk, I think I'm, again, convinced that perhaps less time on cosmology and the afterlife and such things is probably warranted, and I'll try to focus more on the basics. First of all, just to give you a rough timeline of Jubusto, you can see that in comparison with the Hebrew Bible, which dates from at least 700 BCE, probably older than that, Buddhism and Stoicism are relative newcomers, looking at Zeno at around 334 BCE, something like that. Seneca at about 4 BCE. It's interesting that the Hebrew Bible, Buddhism, and Stoicism all arose in what the philosopher and psychiatrist Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, roughly the period of about 800 BCE to 200 BCE. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there are some reasons for that, as the next slide will suggest. There may be some historical links among these three traditions, but I would underline that with some heavy skepticism. There is a kind of lore that says that the compiler of the Talmud, Rabbi Yehuda or Judah Hanasi, was a friend of one of the Antonine Roman emperors, either Antoninus Pius, who was just before Marcus Aurelius, or possibly, maybe, Marcus Aurelius himself. I think that's kind of folklore, but it is interesting, and you'll see that connection suggested in the literature quite a bit. Buddhism and Stoicism, again, I think we're speculating here. There may have been some indirect influence via a fellow named Pyrrho of Elis. You may know Pyrrho from the term Pyrrhonism, a kind of skepticism, the notion that we should suspend judgment about all beliefs. He had traveled widely in India, and in a biography of Pyrrho, Diogenes Laertius' biography, there's some suggestion that perhaps some of the ideas that he picked up in India might have sort of filtered back to ancient Greece and maybe to the Stoics. It's sort of fun to speculate about these things. Buddhism and Judaism, interestingly, for all the similarities that I'll talk about, I couldn't find any direct historical links either at the time of the Buddha or during the Talmudic era. But it seems like more than a coincidence that these faiths arose mostly in the critical period that Jaspers mentioned. So, I'm going to give you kind of a very quick overview of these traditions. You've already had quite a bit on Stoicism, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about that. I think perhaps people might be less familiar with Judaism and Buddhism, so I'll spend a little more time on those. So, Judaism. It's usually described as ethical monotheism. I think that's self-explanatory. One indivisible God, creator of the universe, who requires and specifies moral behavior. One thing that I'll stress in distinguishing these traditions is that in Judaism, the relationship of God to man is what I call CRP. It's covenantal, it's reciprocal, and it's personal. And I don't think we really see that in the Buddhist or in the Stoic traditions, and I'll talk more about that in a little later. The Torah, from yara, to instruct, is both the ethical foundation and the underlying moral structure of the universe. There is an interesting story that the Torah actually preceded the creation of the world, so that the Hebrew God of the Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, was consulting the Torah as kind of a blueprint. Well, let's see, day one, I should do this. People should not murder, and so on. And then in the sense that it represents the underlying moral structure of the universe, maybe you can see some similarities already to the Logos, the Stoic Logos. The preeminent Jewish value, I think it's fair to say, is the sanctification of life. Almost every other value yields to that, so that all of the various customs that the Orthodox Jews adhere to on the Sabbath and so on all of those get thrown out if there really is a life at stake. That's sort of the bottom line. Happiness, osher in Hebrew, basically is, what a surprise, the cultivation of virtue. I don't think there's a clearer relationship to Stoicism than that. So happiness is not getting drunk or going out and watching movies and so on. It is a kind of a partnership with God. Other values, of course, pursuit of peace, justice, loving kindness, generosity, self-mastery, moderation, humility, highly valued in Judaism. And that may sound familiar too. Self-mastery, yeah, there's a connection there. Respect for self and others, trustworthiness, gratitude, and tact. Moving again very quickly, the main elements of Buddhism are really quite different on a theological level. There really is no creator God or supreme being in Buddhism, although in Mahayana Buddhism, some of the Buddhas have a kind of godlike quality attributed to them. The three main values in Buddhism, the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama, the Dhamma or Dharma, which is kind of the moral code, and the Sangha, the community of followers. Dharma is a universal law which governs both the physical and the moral order of the universe. And again, if you think about the Stoic idea of the logos, you can see already, I think, you can see some overlap here. You have probably heard of the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. Actually, Professor J. Garfield has said it would be more accurate to call them the four truths that contribute to a noble life. Suffering is a basic part of life. What a surprise. Suffering is caused by selfish craving, tanha. We can eliminate suffering by eliminating selfish craving. And suffering due to selfish craving can be eliminated by following the Noble Eightfold Way, which involves right conduct, right speech, right understanding, and 4 or 5 others. There are a number of Buddhist terms which some of you may be familiar with. Everybody knows about karma, bad karma, good karma, but it's really just the impersonal causal principle that underlies retributive justice. Samsara, the eternal cycle of birth and death and rebirth. Shunyata, which is emptiness or dependent origination. It really just means that nothing exists on its own apart from other entities. Everything is linked in this sort of causal web. Anatman, an interesting idea that we really have no self. There is no unitary self or soul. Instead, we have these, what are called skandhas. They're personal elements like perception, conception, volition, but not a self. Anicca, impermanence, uncertainty. Much of our suffering in Buddhism, they say, stems from our unwillingness to accept the impermanence of all things. And important, I think, from the Stoic standpoint, alobha, non-attachment to things, or even concepts, or even attachment to Buddhism. And you may have heard that crazy Zen koan, if you meet the Buddha on the road, what are you supposed to do? Kill him, right? That seems a little odd. But I think one interpretation of that, and there are hundreds of interpretations, is you don't get attached even to Buddhism. So it's a striking kind of notion. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over what Ronald and Chuck have gone over already, but I think it's important to emphasize that the logos is this idea of the underlying rational principle that governs the cosmos. The Stoic cosmos is deterministic, yes, but humans have some degree of self-determination in conjunction with necessity. Man should live in harmony with reason, nature's laws, and, of course, emotional modulation and moderation. The Stoics believed, and I'm quoting Marcus here, all things are woven together, and the common bond is sacred. And, very important for REBT and CBT, our thoughts determine our feelings. And although I'm not going to be speaking specifically about the workplace, I know that that is the theme today, it's clear that Stoic philosophy has great relevance here. Is it the workplace itself that determines our happiness, or is it our thoughts about the workplace? Is it the obnoxious, overbearing boss that drives you crazy, or is it your thoughts and ideas about the boss? And I know that one of the workshops will be looking at these ideas. And finally, what I personally consider the central teaching of Stoicism. Nothing is of real worth except maintaining one's virtue. 8 common features of Judaism and Buddhism. This is what I have sort of pulled together as what the 3 traditions have in common. This is kind of a brief preview. Thinking clearly and carefully about your experience. There's a direct connection between how much we suffer or flourish in life and how clearly we think. There is this realm of human concern that constitutes the common bond that unites all of us. And this bond imposes certain ethical obligations on us. By fulfilling these obligations, we live a fulfilled life. So the link between happiness and virtues is critical to all 3 faiths. Other features that I think are in common among these 3 traditions: limiting desires and attachments, appreciating impermanence and mortality, which becomes, as you may know, very important later, much later, for the existentialists, for philosophers like Heidegger. Being grateful for what we have, essential to all these faiths. Self-mastery and avoidance of anger. So now, to dig down into the 4 areas that I mentioned earlier: tact, empathy, and compassion. And I'm going to examine these with a few selected quotes. I was very glad that Chuck quoted Hillel earlier. In Judaism, do not do to others what is hateful to you. Very similar in Buddhism. Speech, when it brings no evil to others, is a pleasant thing. Stoicism, Marcus says that a man's proper work is kindness to his fellow man. The Dalai Lama was once asked, summarize Tibetan Buddhism for us, and his answer was kindness to others. So we can eliminate a lot of metaphysics, can't we? I think Chuck would agree with that. Anger, rage, and revenge. All 3 traditions take a pretty dim view of anger, though to somewhat varying degrees. Interestingly, the Talmud does not say avoid all anger. It says don't anger easily. And that's a very crucial distinction, because nobody can avoid anger entirely. Whatever you may read in any philosophy, it just can't be done. But not angering easily is important. In Buddhism, basically it emphasizes that anger is a kind of poison along with greed and ignorance, and it sort of burns us up or covers us with excrement. Stoicism, I think, may have the strongest stance against anger of any sort among these 3 traditions, regarding it as almost never useful or justified. Maybe there are some exceptions to that, but I don't think there are many. Worry, sorrow, and depression. Essentially, all 3 traditions teach that, to borrow from Shakespeare, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. In the rabbinic tradition, Maimonides is kind of the exemplar of this. It is the duty of man to subordinate all the faculties of his soul to reason. And Buddhism, we are what we think. And, of course, Marcus' famous statement, things do not touch the soul. Your anguish comes from judgments within. Joyfulness, gratitude, and pleasure. Here, all three traditions place a very high value on gratitude, joy, and pleasure. On gratitude, excuse me. Joy and pleasure are not frowned on, but they are delimited and carefully defined in terms of being grateful for what one has and not craving more than that. So the Talmud says, who is rich? He who rejoices in his portion. Buddhism says basically the same thing. Be glad that you didn't die during the night. Stoicism, again, the same idea. Seneca stresses the idea that you should make do with what you have, make the most of things that come your way. Well, now, briefly, I'll try to compare and contrast these faiths, because despite a number of similarities, there are important differences, though they're mostly in the realm of metaphysics, ontology, cosmogony, and all these fancy ideas, metaphysics. Not really so much in ethics or how to live the good life, as I think Chuck's talk pointed out. And I am mindful of the point made by John Sellers in his interview with Donald Robertson in 2016. Stoicism is a philosophy, he said, not a religion. Well, of course, the same thing has been said about Buddhism, that it's a philosophy and not a religion, and I think sometimes the line between philosophy and religion is not always so easy to discern. So, very briefly, going through these areas, cosmogony refers to how the universe began. In Judaism, it's pretty simple. God made it out of primordial elements. In Buddhism, there is no creator God. There is no creator God. And space and time are cyclical, and the world kind of comes into existence and goes out of existence, and this goes on and on and on endlessly. And in Stoicism, it's a bit more complicated. The Logos is uncreated and indestructible, while matter is eternally destroyed and created. In terms of the Supreme Being, again, pretty straightforward in Judaism. There's Yahweh, there's God, one God, omniscient, omnipotent, perfect. Buddhism really is not God-based, and there's no evidence that the Buddha himself believed in a sort of a creator. Stoicism, here we have this idea of the Logos, and the idea of the Logos or Supreme Being as an intelligent fire, an animated ordering principle, divine reason pervading the cosmos. And I liked Dr. Chakrapani's condensation, God is living rationally. This is, of course, oversimplifying considerably, and there are folks here I know who will have a much more nuanced view of the Logos than I have. The afterlife, well, it's not clearly defined in Judaism. It's barely mentioned in the Torah. It's only later in the period of the Pharisees, around 100 BCE, that the idea of the afterlife is really developed as an idea of rewarding people for following God's ways. And Judaism really doesn't emphasize the afterlife much at all. It's sort of what can you do here on earth to repair the world, tikkun olam. Buddhism also doesn't spend a lot of time on the afterlife. And because there is no self, anatman, there is no personal immortality. You say, well, if there's no personal immortality, how do these souls sort of transmigrate? And that gets complicated. Something must persist, but there is no personal immortality. And I think that it's fair to say the same thing is true in Stoicism. The soul, or the pneuma, is corporeal, and it's subject to destruction. Source of morality and ethics. Well, pretty simple in Judaism. It's God's law. That's the source of morality and ethics. In the Buddhist ethics, basically we have the Dharma, universal law governing both the physical and the moral order of the universe. And in Stoicism, as we've heard from the other speakers, the basic idea is living according to nature. And justice arises from the natural extension of human concern for others. Free will and determinism. Well, Judaism's pretty clear. We've got free will, period. You're responsible for everything you do. Even when you're sleeping, you're responsible for rolling over and hitting your bed partner. You did it. You own it. So it's pretty clear. Sleeping is no excuse. Buddhism, we really don't find the idea of free will in Buddhism, but we find the idea of a free action, which is one that is free from ego and free from attachment. Stoicism, well, we have a deterministic causal order in the universe, no question about that, but human beings can exercise autonomy, quote, in conjunction with necessity. And you probably know the famous analogy attributed to Zeno and sometimes to Chrysippus. When a dog is tied to a cart, if it wants to follow, it is pulled and it follows, making it a spontaneous act coinciding with necessity. But if the dog fights it, then there's going to be problems. So it is with men too. Even if they don't want to, they will be compelled to follow what is destined. So, just in the few remaining minutes, to summarize, Judaism, Buddhism, and Stoicism have different cosmogonies, different theologies, no question about that. But all three traditions emphasize reason, rationality. These are inherently good in all three traditions. Feelings depend on how we think and how we frame events. We must limit our desires and attachments. That's crucial. A common bond unites all human beings and imposes universal ethical obligations. And finally, the importance of gratitude, self-mastery, moderation, and the avoidance of anger. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much, and there's Marcus. Appreciate your attention.